I just want to say a welcome to everyone. I'm Jane Andrews. I'm the new president of the San Diego City League. Can't hear? Oh, how's this? Okay, I have to remember the angle. And
I'm Marianne Vega Clancy. I'm the president of the North County League.
so it's a pleasure really to see all of you.
Before we start, truly, I want to emphasize something very important, that the League of Women Voters does not support or oppose any political candidate or political office. Our nonpartisan stance is a bedrock principle, and it is guided by our values. This is a book of the impact on issues for the League of Women Voters. You can buy it on Amazon. We are guided by our values, not by affiliations. But nonpartisan does not mean silent. During campaigns, we provide balanced information to help our voters make informed choices. That's empowering voters. But once elections are over, we hold elected officials accountable, regardless of their party affiliation. We hold them accountable when their policies conflict with our league values. And then we do speak out. That's not partisanship. That's defending democracy. And now I'd like to turn this over to our North County VP of Events, Mona Pastor, to introduce our speakers.
Good morning. I've spoken to a lot of you, and we are pleased to offer 3 speakers today who will speak on differing aspects of the topic of money in politics. This has been an important league topic for decades. Thank you. First, we have Professor Bryan Adams of the San Diego State University Political Science Department. His research examines the role of local elections in our democracy and whether the existing campaign finance system undermines our democracy. In addition to academic research, Bryan is the author of the book Campaign Finance in Local Elections, Buying the Grassroots. And he has another book forthcoming on local politics, which will be published soon. He was a key speaker at last year's all-county webinar on this issue, and we are honored that he has returned today in person. Bryan.
Thank you for that. It's great to be here. What I'm going to do today is just talk a little bit about some trends in San Diego politics relating to campaign finance, and then talk a little bit about reforms and what could work and what may not. The first trend I want to highlight is that local politics is awash in money. There are lots of wealthy individuals and interest groups that are more than happy to give lots and lots of money to local candidates. If candidates are willing to play ball, they're willing to give access, to do favors, they can easily raise all the money they need. The problem is that candidates no longer have a very effective way of actually spending any of that money. It used to be that if candidates had a lot of money, they can run lots of TV advertising, and that would be somewhat effective at gaining votes. And they still do TV advertising, but it's actually not particularly effective anymore. Lots of people don't watch cable TV anymore, or they skip over the commercials. And you also, locally, you have to pay regionally for that advertising, even though many of the people in the region aren't actually living in the city in which you're running. So, and other forms of advertising, whether it be social media advertising, which can be very targeted, but no evidence that it's particularly effective, and also direct mail, those piles of junk mail that you get in your mailbox every election season. Also, very little evidence that it particularly sways voters. Given how partisan everything is now, it is really hard for candidates to sway votes. So they've got lots of money to try to do it, and they're really struggling to try to figure out how to use that money. Larry Turner, who ran for mayor of San Diego last November, is a really good example of this. He had lots of people willing to give him money, and even more that would have given him money if he ran a better campaign. But he just couldn't figure out a way to actually spend that money effectively. Todd Gloria was vulnerable. Public approval rating wasn't particularly good. And even though Turner had the money to run, he wasn't able to use that effectively. Now, in some ways, this is a good thing, right? That money you can't use that money to buy an election. And I think that's actually true. There's this myth out there that if you can raise a lot of money, you're guaranteed a victory in an election. And that's simply not true. There are lots of candidates that raise lots and lots of money that fail miserably, right? But that doesn't stop candidates from actually raising money. So we have this really bizarre situation now where candidates will raise all this money and then not know what to do with it and not actually have an effective way to actually spend it. So that's a sort of first trend, is that there's no shortage of money there, but I think there really is, given the changing media landscape and given the hardening of partisan positions, which makes fewer and fewer voters susceptible to persuasion, that candidates don't know what to do with all the money that is floating around local politics. A second trend, and this is also related to increasing partisanship, is that the increasing partisanship has removed some of the constraints on candidate fundraising. It used to be that candidates were a little bit hesitant from taking money from certain interest groups because it may color how voters see them, right? Candidates wouldn't want to take money, for example, from the tobacco industry because it would look bad on the candidate and they could potentially lose votes by doing that. Now, with people being so partisan, they're willing to overlook all of that for members of their own party, right? So a lot of voters are like, I don't care whether the candidates from my party who they raise money from. They can raise money from anybody they want. They can raise money from Meth Dealers of America PAC, perfectly fine. As long as it's my party, I'm voting for them. And so I think actually a lot of candidates now are free to raise as much money from whoever they want, and that whatever little constraint there used to be is completely gone. Now, doesn't necessarily hold true for Democrat on Democrat races or Republican on Republican races. There, fundraising actually could be used by voters, because if you have two Democrats running against each other, there may not be much that separates them other than the interest groups that are supporting them, right? So in those types of races, candidates still do pay, I think, some attention to where they're raising money from. But when you have a Democrat on a Republican race, that candidates now are like, I can raise money from wherever I want and how much money I want. No one's going to care because they're all going to vote on partisanship anyway. So, I mean, this rise of partisanship really has made the campaign system, I think, even more corrupt than it used to be. There's one more point I was going to make about that. Oh, yes. Voters no longer get outraged about campaign finance, which I find particularly odd given the fact that voters seem to get outraged about everything nowadays, right? So there's all this outrage. All you have to do is turn on cable TV news and you'll see lots and lots of outrage. But campaign finance, not as much. It used to be, right? 20 years ago, a candidate would raise money from a particularly unsavory interest group and there'd be outrage over it. And now people have just become numb to it. And I think that is a real problem because, again, it takes off the reins that candidates have in putting some constraint on how much they're raising and who they're raising that money from. A third trend is that candidates are relying more and more on a handful of very large donors and independent expenditure committees. So when I did my research on campaign finance, I was looking at the years late 1990s to about 2006 or so, right? So this is a while ago. And back then, if you were running for local office, you held fundraisers where you charged $250 a plate dinner or $500 a plate dinner or whatever. And that was primarily where you got most of your money from. You got hundreds, if not thousands, of contributions in $250 or $500 increments from lots and lots of different donors. And there was always some big donors who would have like an independent PAC that would spend money on behalf of candidates and whatnot. But it was a relatively small percentage of the total amount of money spent on politics. That has changed. It has changed dramatically over the past 20 years. Nowadays, there's a very large percentage of the money in local politics is coming from a small number of interest groups that are giving money to independent expenditure committees, which spend money on behalf of candidates but aren't controlled by the candidates. And those they'll spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, basically bankrolling a candidate. Not all candidates do that. There's still some candidates that do it the old-fashioned way, where they're raising money in $250 increments and whatnot, especially in smaller cities. But you see a lot more of those big spenders in local politics than you used to. And that's obviously a real problem, because then those big spenders have a lot of influence over the candidates once they get elected, right? It used to be that if you had a candidate that was raising, $500,000 in $500 increments from thousands of donors, that any one donor isn't going to have a super amount of influence. They would have some, but it would be limited because they'd have lots of other donors that were giving as well. But if you have a candidate where 30% of their campaign spending was from one interest group, that obviously gives that interest group a lot more influence. So political scientists always struggle to really identify and document the influence of campaign contributions, because it's really hard to separate out the influence of donations versus the ideology of the candidate, because they often tend to be very similar. But we know that it does matter, that if you have an interest group that is giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to a candidate, that they're going to have a lot of influence over that candidate. And that has changed. That has gotten worse over the past 20 years, just in terms of donation of, the influence of very large donations to candidates. Okay, so reforms. What can we do about campaign finance? The main argument I'm going to make is that direct campaign finance reforms, like contribution limits or public money or things like that, are not particularly effective. And that if we really want to change the influence of money in politics, we need to change other aspects of local elections. So the traditional campaign form reforms, like contribution limits on how much money that donors can give to candidates, public money, things like clean elections. Most of the research that political scientists have done on these reforms have largely concluded they're not all that effective. Contribution limits do not reduce the total amount of money in politics. Not to say they're a bad thing. I'm not advocating we get rid of all these reforms, but it just doesn't do all that much, right? They're easy ways for candidates to get around contribution limits, and so they're not particularly effective. Things like clean elections. This is where when candidates can run for office, and in exchange for agreeing to either not raising any money from private donors or having an expenditure limit from private money, they get a lump sum of public money to run their campaigns. There's some value in that, and again, I'm not advocating we get rid of clean elections or we not implement it, but there are limits to how effective that reform can be. They're voluntary, so candidates who can want to raise a lot of money can simply not participate. And even for candidates who participate, what we see is that candidates will say they're going to run clean, and then they get interest groups spending a ton of money in independent expenditures, which are not limited by the clean election regimes. So they basically become dirty even though they're running, quote, clean, right? So there are limits to how effective that can be. There's a number of states and cities that have had clean elections for a while now. Arizona was one of the first states to have clean elections. It may have some positive impact in Arizona, but Arizona is still Arizona. And it hasn't fundamentally changed politics in Arizona having clean elections. And again, it could do some benefit. I mean, there has been some research that shows there's some value to having clean elections, but it's marginal. It's around the edges. The latest reform that a lot of advocates are proposing are democracy vouchers. Seattle was the first city to try this. This is where voters get vouchers that they can basically give to candidates, and the candidates can use those vouchers and exchange them for public money. There's some value to this. I actually like the idea of democracy vouchers, especially in smaller cities. I think actually they could work really well, but they're not a solution. There are limits, like with clean elections, to the effects that democracy vouchers can have. Candidates can opt out, and they can raise and spend as much as they want. As with clean elections, you can also, candidates that accept democracy vouchers, and if they accept democracy vouchers, you have to have expenditure limits and limits on fundraising and things like that. But they can also benefit from independent expenditures outside of their campaigns, and there's no restriction on that. And in fact, candidates in Seattle have been doing that. And candidates can actually manipulate voters to give them their vouchers, and many voters in Seattle actually didn't use their vouchers. So again, it could be some positive around the margins, but I wouldn't expect democracy vouchers to fundamentally change how local elections are run. Okay, so what do we do? First, I'd say we should give up on the idea of trying to limit the overall amount of money in politics. It'll never happen, right? And even if the Supreme Court tomorrow were to overturn its cases that basically equated campaign spending to speech and allowed government to limit money, I just can't see an effective way to actually do this that is fair to all candidates. I think it's just a fool's errand to try to take money out of politics, and especially in the partisan environment we find ourselves in, I just don't think it's going to be effective. So what else? What are some other options? Well, one thing is simply have better disclosure. And I know the league is working on this, which I think is a good thing. The simply having, if everybody knew what all the money that candidates were raising, that could really be beneficial. One of the problems we have now is that when journalists report on local campaign finance, they generally look at how much money the candidates are raising. But as I was saying before, most of the money now is actually coming from outside of the candidates. It's coming from these independent expenditure committees. And it's a lot harder to actually track all of that. So having better disclosure where voters can see, okay, if we add up all the money the candidate is spending plus all this independent spending, and we get a better total picture of where the money is coming from, who's supporting the candidate, and so forth, that could be valuable. Now, there's a limit to that, though, because as I was saying, with this hyper-partisan world that we live in, voters may not care all that much about where that money is coming from. But at least in some races, particularly when you get the Democrat on Democrat races, or Republican on Republican races, maybe better disclosure could actually put some constraints on elected officials and who they're raising money from, and so forth. Some other ways to try to deal with the issue of money in politics. And these all have to don't deal directly with the issue, but have some sort of positive impact, I would say. The first, and this is going to seem like an odd recommendation, is ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is where you get rid of primary elections, and then during the general election, voters rank the candidates, and you sort of have an instant runoff election. What ranked choice voting does is it reduces the number of elections the candidates have to run in from 2 elections to just 1. With only 1 election to run in, they actually, a shorter campaign season, and they actually raise less money. Or at least that would be my hypothesis. There hasn't been a lot of research on this about the effects of ranked choice voting on campaign finance. I did look a little bit at San Francisco when they moved to ranked choice voting when I was doing my book. And I did see actually a little bit of a decrease, not a lot, but somewhat of a decrease in the amount of money that candidates were raising because they only had to run in 1 election. Ranked choice voting is good for other reasons as well that I won't go into. But I think that could actually, things like that could simply reduce the amount of money in politics without having any type of campaign finance reform per se. Second thing, and I don't know how to do this, is to try to convince people to consider candidates that aren't well funded. Every election cycle, there are candidates that run these grassroots campaigns, these dark horse candidates that don't raise a lot of money, and they invariably lose. Even in small cities where you'd think you'd be able to run without a lot of money, they invariably lose. And voters just simply aren't willing to vote for those candidates. And I don't quite know why. There hasn't been really good political science research on this, of like sort of why voters won't consider a poorly funded candidate and actually vote for them. One reason may be that voters actually look at the amount of money that candidates raise as a sign of legitimacy, saying, oh, that people are giving money to that candidate, they must be pretty good, or at least they're not bad. Or this other candidate can't raise any money, no one wants to give them money, so therefore something must be wrong with them. That, of course, is a recipe for actually, it gives benefits to candidates for raising a lot of money from wealthy donors, right? And certainly we don't want to do that. I don't know how to get around that problem. I think part of it is you need to find ways to help unfunded candidates or poorly funded candidates from actually getting their message out. And it's very difficult for them to do so, right? Because candidates can say all sorts of things. And they can say really good things that voters like. But voters are skeptical of anything coming from the candidate. And it's really hard to provide voters good information, saying, okay, this is information about this candidate that's reliable, that is actually accurate, that's not coming from the candidate or not coming from the candidate's opponents, and you can base your vote on that. So I think that's really the key aspect here, is that voters are kind of in this bind of where if they want to say, well, I don't want to support candidates that are getting lots of money from powerful interest groups or from wealthy donors, but what are my other options? And they look at the other candidates like, well, I don't know anything about those candidates. They don't advertise because they don't have any money. They say things, but I don't know if what they're saying is true or not. So for a lot of voters, it may just be safer to go with the established candidates that are raising tons of money. And therefore they don't support those candidates. But for me, that seems to be like the really important piece of this, is that we need to find ways so that voters have the information that they need to actually vote for candidates that they like, and that where candidates don't have to raise a lot of money to actually communicate with voters, right? I mean, most of the money that candidates spend is spent on advertising, spent on TV advertising, social media advertising, direct mail advertising, and that advertising, of course, costs a lot of money. And that's why they're raising all this money from these wealthy donors and whatnot. I'm out of time, right? So give me 30 seconds. That's why they're raising all of this money, because they have to communicate. We need to find ways in which that candidates can actually run campaigns where they don't have to spend money to actually advertise. So I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. That was quite informative. And up now is David Edward Berg, who also spoke at last year's webinar here. David is the founder of Citizens Take Action, which is a nonprofit that supports policies and programs to enhance the voices of individuals within our political system. Can you hear me? Okay.
That's better.
Okay, so his nonprofit is Citizens Take Action. That was in the bio we sent out too. But in addition to having spoken at a number of Orange County city councils to convince them to enhance their election laws, David is now the mayor of Cypress, California. So that is perhaps one of those underfunded candidates that did have a victory. An attorney, he's also worked in Congress, coordinated statewide ballot initiatives, and clerked for 2 Superior Court judges. Thank you for returning in person this time, David.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I can skip my own introduction and save some time. To give you a little bit of info about my background, my dad was a high school government teacher, so I've always been interested in politics and government. And I worked in Congress briefly after college, and it's there that I really had an awakening about the role of money in politics, seeing how much time elected officials spend fundraising, seeing how lobbyists and donors get so much more access to representatives than average residents do. And then now being a local elected official, I've seen the influence of money in politics there, where you're usually talking about developers, labor unions, trash companies that are doing the same kind of spending that pharmaceutical companies are at the federal level and kind of getting what they want, even if it's not what the majority of residents want. At Citizens Take Action, our core work sort of started out as focusing on a constitutional amendment at the federal level that would allow us to kind of undo the damage done by decades of Supreme Court decisions that let unlimited amounts of money flow into politics. But more recently, we've transitioned more to a focus at the local level and supporting reforms and advocacy there. And while the federal piece is still incredibly important, we think the local efforts are more practical and realistic at this current moment. And so what I want to do today in this presentation is walk you through two things, really. First is what sort of reforms you can advocate for at the local level that we think can make a difference. But second is just give you a better sense of, give you recommendations of what you can do as just an individual or as part of an organization to make a positive impact in the sort of battle against big money in politics at the local level. I want to leave you with some concrete sort of action items or steps you can take, because I know it can feel overwhelming, but I really do think that there's room for just one resident in a community to make a difference. And so I'm going to jump into our report cards and give you a sense of those. So we created these local government report cards that grade cities on their campaign finance laws and the strength of transparency of campaign finance data. We started in 2022. We've created them for 7 different counties in California now. Orange County was the first, San Diego was the second. And we assess cities on a number of criteria, which I'll go through in a moment. And I do want to, I guess in light of Brian's comments, mention something that I agree with him on, and I want to provide context for. So I think that there are questions about the overall effectiveness of certain campaign finance reforms, especially I think, so my thesis is, or my belief is, the higher you get in terms of the size of the city or state level or federal level, I think campaign finance reforms are a little less impactful. Because in a city like San Diego, for example, even if you have low campaign contribution limits, there's just so much money coming in through independent expenditures that it's going to find a way. I do think in smaller cities, I think it can make more of an impact because they're not so awash in special interest money, or at least the magnitude isn't as high. And the city I live in and represent is a city of 50,000 people. And so I'm sort of, largely when we're talking about advocating for reforms at the local level, we tend to think they're most effective in smaller cities and not the 3 or 4 biggest cities in the state of California. So what our report card does is essentially we created recommendations, and one's a little cut off, but I remember, don't worry. So we look at, have cities enacted their own campaign contribution limits? We recommend $1,000 or less. If a city hasn't enacted a limit, the state default limit is $5,900, which we consider very high. That's actually higher than the limit for governor's races in 27 states. So we think in California, it's beneficial for cities to enact a lower limit than that. We also look at, has a city enacted any limits on contractors or developers who are directly doing business with the city? A state law, SB 1439, recently enacted some requirements or some limits in that area, but there are a number of loopholes, and so that's still something that a city can look at individually. We also look at, do cities have a fundraising window when they limit the amount of time during which candidates or elected officials can raise money? And then we look at the transparency. Do cities post the relevant forms that allow you to see the campaign contributions and the independent expenditures so you can know whose money is behind your elected officials? Do they put them on the city website in a place that's easy to access? Or some cities, they don't really post them at all. And so we want to make sure cities are putting that information out there. And then we also look at additional reforms like publicly financed elections or enhanced disclosure requirements or things of that nature. The key findings in San Diego County. So I'd love to tell you San Diego was terrible and you have so much work to do, but being truthful, San Diego is one of the better counties in the state of California. A majority of cities have enacted their own campaign contribution limits. When we did the study in 2023, the average limit in those cities was $535. Some cities even had low limits of $500 or less, which was quite good. 3 cities had enacted their own prohibitions or contribution limits on contractors or developers. And a note, if a city has a $1,000 limit or a $500 limit, they probably don't need like a unique limit for contractors or developers. It's more in a city that has the default $5,900 limit that you really want to make sure some restrictions are in place on contractors or developers. 3 cities had a fundraising window. Most cities simply don't consider that and don't seem to have them. I personally think it's good because I don't want elected officials raising money constantly or being able to get a large campaign contribution, 13 months or whatever it is before they're voting on a contract, but most cities have not enacted fundraising windows. In terms of transparency, most cities in San Diego County have posted the relevant forms and data in a place that's typically not too hard to find. About half of cities go back 4 election cycles. We recommend cities post the data going back at least 4 election cycles because typically that lets you see all the money behind your current elected officials. Whereas if a city only posts the most recent year, then you're not going to see probably half the council and where their money came from. And then some cities in San Diego have enacted additional reforms like limits on contributions by political parties, which is interesting in our partisan times, limits on loans from a candidate to their own campaign, and things of that nature. I'll get to the highest scoring cities. So overall grades in San Diego, you'll see a lot of cities scored an A, and then you had 5 Ds or Fs. One thing you notice about our grades is typically a city has either never enacted a single reform of any kind in this area and they got a D or an F, or they've enacted a reasonably thoughtful campaign finance ordinance, in which case they did enough to get an A or a B. And so the highest scoring cities were, you can see the scores there, but Chula Vista did particularly well. The city of San Diego actually does a very good job, and so I think some of you may find that a little puzzling. That's kind of a testament to what I mentioned earlier. In a large city where the Supreme Court won't let us stop independent expenditures, even in cities with good campaign finance laws, they're just awash in outside money. And the Supreme Court has essentially said there's nothing you can do to stop it. Then you see some cities that got Ds or Fs. El Cajon was the worst because they had actually raised the campaign contribution limit. Instead of having the state's default of $5,900, they said we want more, and so they raised it up to $10,000. And not many cities do things like that, but occasionally you see it. Since our report card was published, most cities have kind of kept the status quo. One thing that was interesting or encouraging was since we published it, Imperial Beach actually went from, I believe, having no law to enacting a $250 campaign contribution limit, which is about as low as you'll ever see. And I know that at least one of the council members was sort of directly paying attention to our report card. And so that's happened a few times in Orange County as well. So we're happy that when we publish this information, sometimes elected officials take notice and improve their transparency or enact a new ordinance. Whoops. No, it's okay. So big picture, I think you have the sense of the reforms that you can consider if you're looking to advocate in your city. There's contribution limits, there's improvements in transparency, there's a fundraising window, there's also publicly financed elections, which Brian had alluded to. And so as you may know, those are systems in which candidates who meet a certain threshold in like donations, small dollar donations or signatures can get matching funds or a lump sum from their city to help fund their campaign. We really think that's ideal because who do you want your council members to be funded by? You want it to be funded by the people they represent. And so publicly financed elections are essentially the public and the people you represent supporting those candidates. And so even though a number of cities in San Diego did really well on our report card, there is room for improvement, and no city in the county has enacted publicly financed elections yet. There we go. And so if you're looking for a reform you can push in any city, maybe you can get a city in San Diego to be the first in the county to consider publicly financed elections. So now I want to get to kind of, okay, what can you do? You're a resident of a city in the county, you want to make a difference, how can you tangibly help? The first is if you want to advocate for reforms in your city, in your community, the way it typically works is you try and organize a few like-minded residents who support campaign finance reforms. I think you could probably get a handful from this room. You contact your local elected official or officials, probably doing some research in advance as who would be the most open to supporting reforms like this. You set up a meeting with them and try and gauge where they're at. You can also raise awareness of these issues through public comments at city council meetings, through letters to the editor, or through organizations like this. And then we can try and provide support as well. I've met with a few elected officials in San Diego County. I've been asked to go to council meetings and give a presentation, essentially telling a city what campaign finance reforms they can enact. And as I said, we have had cities that have changed their laws in response to our recommendations. One kind of staggering thing for me was sometimes when I've given these presentations or talked to local elected official, the official has come up to me afterwards and said, I've been on this council X years. I had no idea we could even do this. Like they just thought the state set the laws and that's all there was to it. So some elected officials, they aren't even aware that they can enact their own campaign finance reforms or require enhanced transparency requirements. So there's a lot of room to educate there. But the second thing I think is kind of interesting as another way to make a difference is essentially you can be a citizen watchdog in your community. Because what goes on is it's very difficult for an average person to find the money behind local elections, to sift through the forms and figure out who's behind this mysterious PAC, to figure out, for residents to really know the truth about what's going on in their city. And so if you can take that on and work with others or work on your own to help accomplish that, you can gather the data or review the data yourself. You can research who's behind these mysterious PACs. It's not always easy. And then you can look for connections to the business in your city. What developer who wants a project is funding one of the local candidates? What trash company that has a contract review coming up is making those independent expenditures? And then the second part I think that's key is get the word out. You can tip off a journalist because they may not be looking, but you can say, hey, this one's looking. Not all of them are. You can write letters to the editor to raise awareness. You can publish the information on a website or on a community Facebook group. You can distribute flyers in your community. And I do want to say that I'm speaking from experience here. So in the city where I'm from, Cypress, in 2022, this group called the Safe Neighborhoods PAC spent $48,000 on mailers to support 3 local candidates. Do you think the PAC had anything to do with safe neighborhoods? It did not. The PAC was funded by the trash company and a local developer. And a resident who learned this information wrote a letter to the editor of our local paper basically outing, hey, residents, these mailers you've been getting about safe neighborhoods are actually paid for by the trash company and a developer. Some residents were so fired up that they made copies of this letter, they distributed it door to door, and it's made a very tangible impact, in my opinion, in our community in terms of just waking people up to what's been going on and who's funding which candidates. And you don't necessarily see, immediate changes the next day, but I think in the long term, it has changed our community's awareness of what their local elected officials are doing. And I think this council that we currently elected and have in 2024 might be the first one in a decade that isn't the majority funded by the trash company or personal friends with the trash company. So I think it has made an impact. And that's the kind of thing you can do in your city. I know the league is already working on putting together kind of a dashboard where they compile this campaign finance information, but you need to spread the word about it. Because if all voters get is 5 mailers from a mysterious PAC, they're not going to know. But if they find out that PAC is actually just this one developer or whomever, it might change how they vote. And then the last thing, time for me to wrap up as well. The last thing, and this was touched on a little bit by Brian, I'd say, is try really hard to elect the ethical people who aren't funded by the mysterious independent expenditures. Do your homework, and if you get those people in office who are truly more independent minded, they're not going to be beholden to special interests. And I think that if you want to look at a basic thing you can do to help, just vet the candidates in your local races, figure out whose money's behind them, and pick the ones who seem like they're really focused on residents rather than cozied up to special interests. And so last thing I'll say is, if you support our work, you can always donate or get involved at citizenstakeaction.org. We're a small grassroots organization. And my email, if you ever want to reach out to me, is simply david@citizenstakeaction.org. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, David. And up now is Lucas Robinson, an investigative journalist with the San Diego Union Tribune. His award-winning work has covered politics, the courts, schools, and, of course, the pandemic. He's worked from places as diverse as Madison, Wisconsin, Marion, Indiana, where I grew up, a town of 30,000, and Argentina. He is now based here in San Diego, and he will report on his recent investigations and perhaps more of Sandag, their no bid contract situation, and the transparency that is or isn't there. Lucas.
First off, I do want to say seeing El Cajon have an F was the least surprising thing I'll see all week. I could have closed my eyes and guessed that. So my name's Lucas. At the Union Tribune, I've been there a little over 3 months now. I'm mainly our San Diego County government and politics reporter. Thank you. I'm mainly our county government and politics reporter, but my work also touches on Sandag, which was the case in this story. And for those of you that don't know, we'll get into this. This is State Road 125. Who's familiar with this situation at Sandag? A good amount of people. This epitomizes the contracting situation at the agency. Long story short is, for years they had a malfunctioning toll road. It was improperly collecting tolls. They covered up this fact, which didn't help, and then they rushed into no-bid contracts that they didn't scrutinize, and the vendor they chose didn't have the expertise to actually do what they were hired to do. So that's some of the things that we see at Sandag. So moving along here, for those of you who don't, I want to just briefly summarize what Sandag is. It's effectively the planning agency of the San Diego region. So when you think of Sandag, you think of infrastructure. They build and maintain rail systems, bike lanes, build roads also, and then they have like an operational capacity, like with the collection of tolls, for instance. And so we were talking about this up here, because being from Orange County, I wasn't familiar with it. Sandag is just, it's one kind of fiasco scandal after another up there. The most recent one being this toll road issue. And so all of the top bureaucrats and leadership at Sandag have kind of been swept aside over the last couple of years, in part because of the toll road issue. Their former CEO resigned at the end of 2023, and their other top officials kind of left or were fired over the last year. So there's a new CEO at Sandag named Mario Orso. He's a former Caltrans highway official, and he's kind of came in vowing a lot of reforms, transparency, this sort of thing. This is his public messaging. And there's some evidence out there that he is making changes there. So just some summary of the agency. So what is this audit that I wrote about? Sandag has a in-house independent auditor who, they have an office in the building, but they're totally walled off from the rest of the agency, and they're charged with looking at different practices and operations at Sandag. Contracting is a big part because by just virtue of what Sandag does, but they look at other things like whistleblower complaints, and the use of agency credit cards. So why do they care about contracts? This is a quote in my story from the independent auditor, Courtney Ruby. She said, "Contracting must be beyond reproach." And the reason for that is Sandag is a government agency. They don't have construction crews and manpower and this sort of thing. So they have to farm this work out to private companies, construction firms, that sort of thing, who do have this expertise, and they spend hundreds of millions of dollars farming out different infrastructure projects to private industry. So the independent auditor had, in the past, over the last few years, looked at Sandag's contracting audits, not no-bid contracts, but contracting generally, and they found policy routinely wasn't being followed. They weren't tracking any of this stuff, and then they were supposed to be. The people in charge of doling out contracts weren't trained properly in what they were and weren't supposed to do. And some really critical stuff, palace intrigue, is the U.S. Department of Justice in 2024 said that they were investigating Sandag for its contracting practices. Now, we really don't know what that was about. No one was charged for it. Essentially, what's on this slide is the extent of what we know. So, but ultimately, the investigation was closed and no one was charged. So, they asked me to talk a little bit about how no-bid contracts should work. I think that's really important. Sandag, because it gets money from different sources, like the state and federal government, those dollars kind of come with different standards they have to follow in terms of how they dole out contracts. But the agency's own policies call for no-bid contracts to only be used in a very narrow set of circumstances, and they're intuitive. A company has to be highly specialized in the thing you want to hire it to do. No one else in town can do this. The process of going out to bid is too costly. It's more expensive than not going out to bid. Like I mentioned, existing expertise. And then this third one here is really critical, where you can have continued follow-on work for a contract. So you've competitively did a bid on the work before, the contractor needs more time, the scope of the work changes, and it's like, okay, they're already doing this, we'll just do a no-bid contract for them to extend the work they're doing. So keep that in mind. So the goodies, as we call them in the newspaper business of this, so they looked at 35 no-bid contracts. That's not all of the no-bid contracts Sandag doled out in this year-and-a-half period of time. About 18% of all Sandag contracts over this period of time, out of 1,400 or something, so you can do that math, I'm not going to, were no-bid contracts. And so total, all no-bid contracts was about $78 million, and the kind of sample size they had was about $44 million. So this is a lot of money. And with all these, it was just the basic documentation of how this was supposed to work was not included. Their computer system doesn't work in the right way to even track this stuff. Really another big thing is they approved 50 no-bid contracts over a single email, totally skirting any sort of the way this is supposed to go. Basically, like, here's all the lists, emails sent, no competitive process at all. The money is going to these companies. Another issue they had was the auditor theorized that Sandag does such a poor job actually planning their projects. They don't know how much it's really going to cost in the first place. So there were companies who had a no-bid contract, and for one reason or another, they were like, we need more money to do this. And they had cost hikes reaching over 3,000% changes, 1,000% changes. And that was mainly due to and this is another one, lack of data metrics. They just aren't tracking like the performance measures of these contractors. You know, you're supposed to do this X, Y, and Z in the contract. They don't keep track of this, or they weren't keeping track of this at all. Another critical finding of the audit was that a handful of companies got repeated no-bid contracts from a small handful of Sandag managers, which led auditors to theorize that the disproportionate amount of no-bid contracts these companies were getting, again, in a situation where their contracting practices are so poor, it probably amounted to favoritism. One of those companies is this Kansas City firm called HNTB, and they were brought on to basically conduct oversight of the toll road system when they knew behind the scenes that it was going wrong. Clearly they did a great job at what they were tasked with doing. Another kind of critical thing to know is over this isn't in the story because it's not part of the audit, but over this period of time, this company, H&TB, their main consultant on their Sandag work was Kevin Faulconer, the former mayor of San Diego. There's a high cost of living, obviously. You know, I'm sure he's hand to mouth and, you know, needed a few $100,000 to help Sandag with this. So that's a very critical kind of thing to keep in mind when you kind of want to paint a picture of how contracting works at the agency in this period of time. And then this wasn't even, I reread the audit yesterday and I missed this in the story, but it was interesting. A different company basically went to Sandag and was like, we want a contract for our buddies and this other subcontractor, can you just give it to them? And they just gave them a no-bid contract, didn't scrutinize at all. They had no cost estimates, no review whatsoever of like if they were even able to do the work they were hiring them to do. It speaks for itself. So what has happened since then? And this is kind of important to know. So the period of time in this audit it's a little old. It was kind of mid-2022 to the end of 2023, before the new leadership has been in place at Sandag. There was a recent independent auditor report that did find that dozens and dozens of previous audit recommendations, about half of them in the last year, have been implemented. So I think, and Ruby, the independent auditor, attributed this to the new leadership at the agency, that they are taking seriously the things auditors have told them in the past and trying to get it done. But the things that haven't been resolved involve contracting. And there's different reasons for this. One issue is Sandag's own record-keeping system. They've had to change it multiple times, and each time it never can like track what they actually needed to do, so they kind of ping-pong back and forth with it. So they're doing another system change, and hopefully that will allow them to start tracking their contract information better and start complying with past audit recommendations. So yeah, I don't think that was the rest of my side. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, we do have one more brief speaker, and that is, thank you for the signal. So the San Diego League has voted to have one of its items for emphasis in the coming 2-year period be a project that involves making a campaign finance dashboard. And Julianne C. and Kim Knox are the leaders of that, because they're the ones who know how technology works. And Julianne has been very involved in Vote 411. So I'm just going to have her come up and say a word or two about our work, and if you'd like to help out, we'd be glad.
It is harder than it appears to get this mic where it needs to be. Yeah. Thank you for coming and for your interest in money in politics, especially at the local level. We are interested in getting a campaign finance dashboard project off the ground locally so that we can share that information with voters, both through an online election guide, on the websites of the league locally, and also the league is known for its pros and cons presentations, its prop talks, talking about state and local ballot measures. And so adding the campaign finance background of some of these measures in that setting would be very interesting, I think. And especially if we're able to get enough volunteers, if we could have the county offices, the city offices, and also if we could do school boards, that would be very interesting indeed, because a lot of times a school board will have tremendous influence on people's lives, and they're not entirely sure where the money is coming from to support these candidates. So our next election obviously is the June primary next year, but we have the data to be looking a little farther back, and we're hoping that this project can look at data from the last major elections and learn what information is going to be most effective to present for the primary. So if you're interested, I have an interest list. It's no commitment. And I can talk to you more about what kinds of projects, what kinds of tasks you might be interested in doing. And we're hoping to have everything from, just donating an hour here and there to actually adopting a contest and getting more into the nitty-gritty. So I look forward to your interest, and just talk to me afterwards and I'll give your info. Thanks.
Thank you all. And our league will certainly be hearing more about this project. There'll be time to volunteer. So we are now at the Q&A. And one of the things I want to say is before everybody goes, we do want to get a picture of the room. So we'll do that as we wrap up the Q&A, and of course our speakers too. So do you want to go with the first one?
The first two are kind of information.
Okay, for Brian, here's a question. What are the laws regarding money that is left over or unspent after a campaign?
David may actually know a lot about this too, but it varies depending on the jurisdiction. There are some jurisdictions that don't let you carry it over. This gets to the fundraising windows. Other jurisdictions do let you carry it over. So it really does just vary a lot. David, do you want to add more to that? Or?
He's right. It depends on the jurisdiction. Sometimes you just get to keep it. Sometimes you can only use it to pay off like outstanding debt, and there's like a time limit. But yeah, it just varies depending on the jurisdiction.
This is a different one. You want to do this? Okay. What websites contain campaign donations for candidates in San Diego County? Can you say that, Mike?
David, you probably know most about that. But
Well, do you know the best? So for cities, the information is on the cities, should be on the website. It's usually under the city clerk area or an area called like campaign finance disclosures or transparency. For the county, I know you have a county-wide website. What is it?
So the San Diego County Registrar of Voters is the filing agency for county-wide positions, and also most of the school boards. The individual cities have their own depositories where the candidates file the information. But at none of these sites are you able to just call up a nice spreadsheet, a nice pie chart, and make sense of it. It's the individual filings. Sometimes they're in electronic format, so you can pull them into a spreadsheet. Sometimes it's the kind of PDF that thinks it's a photograph, so you can't even grab the information. So this is why we need a lot of volunteers. But again, the county is the depository for things like the hospital, the regional
Hall Hospital candidates who run for office, their filings are there, and again, most of the school boards.
This is another Sandag question. I'm going to combine several questions together that are very similar. And that is that given that Sandag's board is composed of city leadership, why was there not better oversight? How is it that the Sandag doesn't seem to know what's going on with the Sandag staff? Or is it just a matter of the staff, how they report? You understand?
You probably answer this too.
Yeah, go first.
Well, with the toll road, and I meant to say this in the presentation, the independent auditor is a fantastic resource for the public and media because they have just access to the agency that we could never get. But they had found that the Sandag leadership pretty much systematically covered up and purposely withheld information from the board of directors about the toll road issues. I think that gets very much into, we had talked about this, the culture under the previous leadership of the agency, which was pretty adversarial with the board for one reason or another. So I think that's what contributed to it, kind of historically speaking. It's the board is made up of the different elected officials from all the communities, and it's very much you get out of it what you put in. So, it's kind of different elected officials might take interest in it one way or another. I've been told by sources it's not uncommon for elected officials to show up, collect the per diem they get for going, and then leave after 30, 45 minutes. So it's kind of, I think that maybe answer it if you can get it right.
Yeah, if I can just add two quick things to that. With the exception of the city of San Diego and the county supervisors, all the elected officials on the board are part-time. So they've got real jobs during the day, and then they do all their city work, in their spare time. And so a lot of them just don't have the capacity to do real oversight, right? I mean, if you're a part-time city council member from, La Mesa, you're not going to be able to spend hours a week overseeing Sandag, even though you're supposed to be doing that. I'd also add too that, and I have no evidence for this, but I would suspect that some of these contractors who got these no-bid contracts, that they have connections to a lot of those board members as well, and that some of those board members were very happy to see that those contractors got the no-bid. So it's not necessarily the case that the entire board is always necessarily opposed to these no-bid contractors as well. But again, I'm just speculating on that.
Okay, sources of money may have become less important than previously. However, we have found that when we give prop talks on the ballot issues, that voters do care about who is funding ballot measures. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think ballot measures are a different aspect because they're not as partisan, right? I mean, so that you don't have, a Democrat versus Republican type of thing. When I was talking about where voters are, for many voters, when they look at candidate races, partisanship is all that matters now. And that they're not going to pay attention to other things. But I would agree that ballot measures are a different ball of wax. And actually, there is a significant amount of research to show that actually the backers of a ballot initiative, who's backing it, actually does influence voter behavior.
Thank you. Regarding the Sandag audit again, did the audit look at donations from the contracting firms to members of Sandag's board?
No, but that was not part of the audit. That is a subject that really interests me, and you were kind of just getting at it just now. I think it would be the audit has found in the past that under the past leadership, it was pretty customary and this isn't the elected officials part of Sandag, it's the bureaucrats themselves that run it. They would routinely wine and dine their kind of companies that they partnered with in Vegas and New York, I think, and that's kind of also how they went about their business under the old leadership.
All right, this is a series of questions about Sandag. How is Sandag funded? What's the budget? How is the leadership attained? Is it voted in or appointed? And then who oversees Sandag?
So how's it funded?
So thank you. Yeah, I was like also trying to. So it's funded by a variety of sort. We were talking about this beforehand. I looked at a pie chart of this the other day. I would say the majority of its money comes from the state and federal government. I mean, you can basically think about Sandag as like a pass-through agency for federal infrastructure funds. For instance, like under Biden, they had like the big infrastructure law, and so when they want to spend federal money on a project, it kind of has to go to the local agency on the ground who could then oversee the administration of that funding. Sandag also has a half-cent sales tax that they collect in the county that is also a very big source of their funding. It's called Transnet. I think it was authorized in 2004. That sounds
Second
right.
time,
Yeah. It's been around for a while, and that's another big source of their funding that they use. And because that's taxpayer money, they kind of have different oversight committees in terms of, and they try to track how those local tax dollars are spent on projects. How is leadership of Sandag attained, voted, or appointed? So like we said, the board of directors of Sandag is appointed from the different municipalities in the county that they represent. It consists of mayors, council members, county supervisors. The Sandag leadership of the bureaucracy, their CEO is appointed by the board. But in terms of like the underlings of the CEO, it's similar to any sort of agency where these are internal hires, like in any job that you would have. Who oversees Sandag? Oh, that's a good one.
I can actually answer that,
Please.
So the state government actually has authority over Sandag. So Sandag doesn't have like any home rule or city or charter or anything like that. So the state government through legislation can change Sandag. In fact, they did a few years ago. They changed the voting patterns, the voting requirements within Sandag. So ultimately, if there's misconduct at Sandag, the state government could potentially come in and do something about that.
In San Diego County, how are campaign finance violations reported?
Well, the statewide entity that handles campaign finance violations is the FPPC, the Fair Political Practices Commission. And so that's typically how most violations are reported. There's some challenges with that. Often it takes a very, very long time from the point that a complaint is made to the point that a complaint is investigated and a penalty occurs. I've also read that even when the FPPC does issue fines or penalties for elected officials who broke the law, those aren't often collected. So overall, I would say that the FPPC is the primary entity that's responsible for that, but I don't think that we necessarily have the resources devoted to that entity that we need to do the kind of level of enforcement that we would ideally be doing.
Can you say something about who can file a complaint?
Yes, I believe anybody can. And you can even file a complaint anonymously if there's a complaint you'd like to file but don't want your identity known to the public. And so you can go on the FPPC website and file complaints. Now they only do investigate certain types of things. I think like violation of conflict of interest rules, illegal campaign contributions. I don't think they investigate, for example, like a misleading mailer. That's just not their purview, but you can go on their website and see what they investigate, and you can file a complaint within 30 minutes if you have the information.
I'll just also add quickly that the City of San Diego does have an ethics commission, and they enforce the City of San Diego ethics campaign finance ordinance. I believe they're the only city that has their own ethics commission in San Diego. I'm not sure if there's any others. I don't think the county does either. The county, I don't.
Since we are talking a lot about Sandag, I just wanted to remind everyone that we're talking about no bid contracts, and that's one aspect of Sandag. But the North County League does have a volunteer observer who reads the Sandag agendas and observes the meetings and reports back to the league about issues that Sandag is discussing that impact our values.
And can she stand up? Please.
Mary Thompson, thank you for your work.
Okay. This is directed towards Brian. While perhaps not effective in the overall amount raised, are small donations effective in hooking a voting base?
Yeah, I think first of all, it depends on the size of the city, and I will. Before I answer that question directly, I do agree with David in that I think a lot of campaign finance reforms do work better on a local level. It is different in a lot of ways if you're running in a city of 50,000 people or 100,000 people versus a city like the city of San Diego. But yeah, I do think that, going back to what I was saying before about voters using fundraising as a sign of legitimacy, right? Small donations could actually do that, right? If you have a candidate that is raising, $20 donations from a whole bunch of people, I think other voters could look at that and say, yeah, this shows that this person's not a crazy. They actually are reasonable in some ways. All these people are willing to actually give them money. So I actually think that is if I'm advising a candidate running a grassroots campaign, collect at least some small amount of money, even if it's not going to be helpful for you to pay for advertising or whatnot, because it does send a signal to other voters that you are a legitimate candidate. You have some level of popular support. And I will note this is why a lot of the clean money regimes do require candidates before they get clean money to actually collect a certain number of small donations to demonstrate their legitimacy, and that certainly can be valuable.
Brian, can I for a second?
Sure.
Yeah, and just a real life example, when I ran in 2022, there were, I think, 8 candidates, and I had the most contributions from individual donors in our city of any of the candidates, and I made sure to highlight that because I wanted voters to see, hey, I'm not, getting the bulk of my campaign funded by a developer. I'm knocking on doors. You can look at my contributors and see that it's people who actually live here. And so I do think if you can get support from residents, that does make an impact, and you want residents to see that you have support from the community.
Oh, and one more thing before we move on. This is also how democracy vouchers are supposed to work as well, is that the idea is that if you can get these voters to give you your voucher, it shows that you are a legitimate candidate and sort of to build that sort of groundswell of support. I would love to see democracy vouchers tried in a small city to see if that actually happens. It'd be great, like in El Cajon, to actually see if it, because the only examples we have so far are in bigger cities, and Seattle is different than a city of 100,000 people or whatever. So that's also the idea behind them, is that it sort of it basically allows for these grassroots candidates to sort of generate amount of public support and public interest by doing that.
All right, we have one last question, and it's kind of a big one. How will or might PACs be eliminated?
David, did you want to start?
So, in my opinion, you can't eliminate super PACs or anything like that and without a constitutional amendment. Or the Supreme Court would have to dramatically change its composition and reverse decades of court decisions. Because essentially, a few court decisions have said that individuals can spend unlimited amounts of money to influence elections through independent expenditures. Corporations and unions can spend unlimited amounts of money through independent expenditures. So maybe Brian has another suggestion, but from my approach, it's the Supreme Court got us into this mess, and you would need to overturn those Supreme Court decisions to get us out of it with regards to super PACs and other PACs.
Yeah, I agree we can't get rid of them, but I would go a step further. I don't know we want to get rid of them because there's a value. If I want to start a PAC, say a Defense of Democracy PAC, and I want to raise money from different people who are opposing anti-democratic measures that various elected officials happen to be taking, that I should be able to do that. I actually don't think that we want to limit the ability of people to actually spend money on politics. Now, obviously, the current system we have now has all sorts of corruption built into it, has all sorts of negative impacts, but you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? I mean, yeah, you don't want to say, well, in order to get rid of that corruption, we're also going to limit legitimate the ability of people to legitimately engage in political discussions and getting engaged in political activity by raising money. So I don't think that the way we should frame this question is how can we get rid of them, but how can we reduce the corruption that flows from it, right? You want to say, okay, well, they're going to exist. People are going to spend money on politics. Interest groups are going to try to influence politics by spending money. That's a given. How can we try to limit the negative consequences from that behavior?
I'd like to briefly, one of my answers wasn't very good. People were asking, where can you find this information? And I don't think I said, so it's the Registrar of Voters website for the county stuff and the non-city stuff. And for the cities, you go to the city clerk.
Can you say a little more detail on the ROV site? What do you look for once you get to the site?
At the top of it's sdvote.com, and at the top it's got I want to, and you've got the pull down menus, and they've got the campaign finance thingy is in there. And there are two portals. There's one for the candidates to file, and there's one for the public. So just make sure you're in the right rabbit hole.
Okay. Thank you so much. Great speakers. We have a little gift for each of you.
Thank you.
We hope you can use, but this has been a terrific program, and thank you all for being good listeners and questioners. And let's give them a round of applause.